my privilege to introduce our next reader, whose book we are celebrating today. Wendy Barker is the author of 7 poetry collections, the most recent being Gloss. Her other books include an anthology of poems about the 1960s, co-edited with Dave Parsons, and a selection of translations of Tagore, translated with Saranindranath Tagore. I really thought I could pronounce that. A recipient of NEA and Rockefeller fellowships, she is the Pearl LeWinn Endowed Chair and Poet in Residence at the University of Texas at San Antonio, where she has taught since 1982. Please welcome Wendy.
Oh, Michael, such a treat to hear you read, and you could have read a lot longer. I think you only read about 10 minutes. So I'm going to hog the show, maybe.
Well, stopping poets is harder than you think.
Thank you all for being here. It's such a joy to see so many old friends, a real joy. And thank you to the folks at Malvern. I mean, we need to support them, so let's all buy books. Afterwards, let's all buy books. So thanks to everybody. I'm going to read from the new chapbook, Shimmer, that came out in the fall, and from the new book, Gloss. I mostly grew up in Tucson, some in Phoenix, but a series of working class neighborhoods, moving, went to 11 different schools in 12 years. My mother made all her clothes, did all the cooking, did all the cleaning, did all that stuff. 1940s, 50s housewife kind of thing. But what didn't make sense was that she came from enormous wealth in England. It just didn't make sense. Her grandfather was in on the beginning of an import-export firm that became the Dodwell and Company that still exists today. If you go to Hong Kong, you can. She grew up in mansions on the top of hills in Hong Kong, Shanghai, all over the place. They had a house, they had a country house in England. This is not Downton Abbey, my dear. This is trade money. Oh dear, the Duchess would be horrified. But she grew up in that upper middle class way. And then, what are we doing in Tucson growing up like this? When my English grandparents came to visit, I mean, they were like people from another planet. I only met them maybe 4 times in my whole life, and it just didn't make sense. Somewhere around 2012, I felt I had to just start writing about her story, start writing my mother's story, which looks real pretty on the outside, real glossy. But I had to gloss, here's the verb, I had to gloss her story. So, some of the poems began with meditations on a Chinese scroll that actually was Steve's, my husband's. But as I began to look at the scroll, somehow the scroll seemed to have sort of hints of what was to come. I'm going to read a couple of them. Shimmer includes meditations on the scroll to begin with, and on the second half of the chapbook, it includes meditations on pieces of silver that later in my life I finally inherited. I didn't grow up with them, but inherited later. So one of the scroll poems to begin with. Along a river. Along a river you will know upstream from downstream. Off these sloped banks, clumped water, hyacinths, mossy strands provide clues. No movement other than scarlet dragonflies flitting the surface, mosquitoes. Beyond, a source you must find. And one poem from the second half of the chapbook about a piece of silver. The silver milk pitcher. The silver milk pitcher on the granite counter holds 1 wooden spoon and 3 spatulas that rise from the round opening like arms waving from a narrow boat, or tongues pulled from a mouth. And now from Gloss. And I'll start by just reading 2 of the epigraphs that begin the book. You can't put the past behind you. It's buried in you. It's turned your flesh into its own cupboard, from Claudia Rankine. And I don't very much care what people do, as long as they don't do it in the street and frighten the horses, King Edward VII. the RMS Queen Mary. Docked since '67 in Long Beach, the same liner Mom sailed in '39 from England to marry my father. Relic of a past the well-heeled now are recreating, cruise being the upscale way to travel, like the tour labeled Alaska's Glorious Inside Passage in 8 days, or the one advertised as Wonders of the Mekong, 10 days down South Asia's amazing river. But the Queen Mary was not designed for this sort of travel, rather to get you from Southampton to New York in less than a week, or from one life to another. Within a year, Mom had lost most of her Britishisms, but not all. Oh, you Americans, she'd shudder at us daughters, though she carried on with Thanksgiving and the 4th of July. The phrase, carry on, holds more weight than hand luggage. Alone on the Queen Mary, not part of any migration. No soft-bosomed granny, no jocular uncles to keep her afloat. Those glossy first-class cabins were kept spotless, been repainted, reupholstered, refurbished. Not a trace of her. Several of the poems in this collection meditate on pieces of silver, differently from the shorter ones in the chapbook. This is the first one meditating on a silver tureen that I inherited later in life. It keeps slamming open, exposing the tangled roots of garlic I store inside it. How often my father quoted Lyre's praise of Cordelia. Her voice was ever soft and low, an excellent thing in woman. Better dead than loud. The tureen won't stay shut. Garlic smell throughout the house. And of course it's prettier when closed, glossier, sleeker. The polished dome like a perfect loaf of risen bread, or a silken breast. Sleek, smooth, easy to run a hand over, no sharp edges.
That's really good.
Thank you, Vika. Thank you. This is a longer one. Little pieces of string too small to be used. Little pieces of string too small to be used. Granny's label on a box in her attic. 4 dozen cardboard boxes, filed alphabetically, and all tied with string. How Mom laughed about Granny. But when at bedtime I'd beg her to tell me about her growing up in England, she'd brush my forehead with a quick, dry kiss, tuck the sheet around my shoulders, close my door. Under the covers, with a flashlight, I read and reread the books Granny sent about 2 West Berkshire kids in the 30s. Was Mom's childhood like theirs? The novels came in a parcel tied with knots so tight we had to use scissors. So by the time we'd unwrapped the box, bits of string littered the cement floor. I'd thank Granny on white blue-lined paper with my Parker fountain pen, and she'd answer on tissue-thin blue paper, stamps of Queen Elizabeth on the envelopes. I even wrote to Grace James, the book's author, and she wrote back on paper just like Granny's, telling me what happened to those children when they grew up, and explaining the stories behind the stories. I kept those pieces of thin blue paper, a tidy stack in my bedside drawer, but not wrapped with string. Now, in an old box, I found a letter dated 1934, addressed to Mrs. Jacoby, headmistress at Battle Abbey, Mom's public school. My mother's exam scores had been outstanding, and could Mom's parents let her enter Cambridge, where, the letter writer was confident, Mom would go far. But, as Mom told me once, no college for girls of her class, no blue stockings in their family, and she needed to be presented at court, the distinction naughty Mom rejected. My first trip home from college, my bedside drawer was empty. All those blue letters gone. Have to get rid of old things, Mom said, her toes flapping the soles of her sandals. That was after my father hadn't let me accept the scholarships I'd been offered from good colleges back east. As a girl, I'd be a bad investment, since I'd only be getting married anyway. I never kept the letters with those offers, not in a box or a drawer. Daddy did agree to pay for tuition and board at the nearby state school he'd always sneered at. I don't remember when I carried all my diaries, notebooks, and stories out to the galvanized can in the garage. Ripped the pages into bits, everything I'd ever written. Little pieces, too small to be used. Tossed them in. No amount of string could have held them together, or me at the end of my rope. And another of the little scroll poems that are all in syllabics. Maybe they serve as little interrupters, little paces throughout the book, throughout clause, as well as being in the text. Maybe his boat is drifting back toward the mouth of the river. Or he's grown tired from the long push, and the banks down farther lure him by the fine silt of easy slopes, silky tendrils. Perhaps under the mountain's mist, something hides he fears he will reach. Latent Image. Before she died, Mom pulled that photo out of the album, tore it to shreds. The one that showed her at 7, naked, posed like a nymph, a statue on the lawn. Grandfather's insisting she strip in front of the servants and sit like that, her legs folded to one side, her head bent in the opposite direction. His little nymph, stilled in that photo, caught by silver particles, the standard black and white photographic process introduced in 1871. A photo's final image, metallic silver embedded in a gelatin coating. Stills, we say, stopped action, a single frame of a film. Yet I never knew Mom stilled until she died, her trim body beneath a sheet, always moving, vacuuming every crumb of dust to be sucked into the guts of the Electrolux, its bag emptied into the garbage and gone. After dinner, Ed Sullivan on TV, her hands working a needle or scissors, her feet jiggling, toes wriggling. Daytime, her sewing machines roar, her fingers zipping the fabric toward the needle, her foot pressing the pedal, full speed, and driving, always over the limit, as if to say, get me out of here. Silver atoms, freed when silver salts meet the light, form an image that's stable. Once the film's developed, it's bathed in a chemical fixer. Clean water clears the fixer from the print, and the latent image becomes permanent. The story she told me long after I moved away, how, when at 13, she asked her mother what she should do about the black hairs spiraling in her armpits. Granny said, "Father can help you with that." And he did, in the shower, every week, shaving her. And I'll end with the last poem, the last full-length poem in the book. Many of the poems are written in different forms. They're little syllabic scroll poems, and then they're long line lineated poems, and some of the poems I've been reading are prose poems. This is beyond a certain age. I look for Paris and Paris. I will probably butcher the French. Steve, I hope, will not criticize me too much after. Beyond a certain age, I look for Paris and Paris. I know about the syndrome of Paris, triggered when a greenhorn's rosy lensed image turns muddy, but I'm no wistful francophile neophyte. So why am I feeling like I'm so sorry, start over, sorry. I know about the syndrome of Paris, triggered when a greenhorn's rosy lensed image turns muddy, but I'm no wistful francophile neophyte. So why am I feeling like my British uncle, who'd sniped as I left for my first trip to Paris? Why bother with that filth? When my friends heard I was heading again for the City of Light, they said, "Paris, oh yes," in a breathy, pre-orgasmic voice, as if they were picturing my lounging outside a cafe on the Boule Miche, over a café au lait, or a glass of chilled Sauvignon Blanc, as prelude to a blissful night with my husband in a cramped but oh so charming chambre double, forgetting that I can't do caffeine or alcohol. And that, as I'd also forgotten, in mid-July, the sidewalks, the metro, and the galleries would be chock-a-block with chattering Brits, Italians, Yanks, Germans, and Brazilians, along with, since it's the week of the Tour de France, clusters of steel-bodied cyclists. So we're jostled by T-shirts emblazoned with slogans like Endurance Conspiracy and Tourminator. The outing we planned to Giverny is canceled. Too much traffic. When for months I've been yearning to peer down into the waters that spawned Monet's Nymphéos, those rounded walls in l'Orangerie, depths that lead to more depths, dissolving boundaries. Where is the Paris of my mother's rebellious cousin, who painted with Max Ernst? Or the Paris of my grad student and her new husband, noses nuzzling before La Tour Eiffel on their Facebook post? Or the Paris of my 20s, when I first floated into Manet's water lilies, when the Seine glimmered like 1,000 liquid candles as I sauntered across Pont Marie at midnight. On l'Avenue du Clichy, on Rue de Rivoli, I see only dog poop, crumpled plastic bags, and unfiltered butts. A 2-hour wait to enter Notre Dame, facade blocked by tawdry bleachers. Pebbles from the Tuileries have collected in my sandals, though I keep jiggling my feet to shake them out. Maybe I've actually become my British uncle. Samuel Johnson said, if you're tired of London, you're tired of life. I'll bet he put Paris in the same category. After all, didn't he say French faces shine with 1,000 graces? I can't begin to keep up with my mountain goat marathoner husband, who'll cover 7 arrondissements on foot at a greyhound's trot. Yet now, on the day before leaving, I'm fueled by a breakfast of hard-boiled eggs, and he says, how about Sacré-Cœur? It's only a 10-minute walk. We'll take our time. So we do. And the hill with its rounded, gleaming white cathedral is washed with breezes. Inside Les Jardins Renoirs, we are alone in the courtyard, red poppies brimming at green edges of stones, a silence glistening through sudden empty space. And here it is, not Giverny, but a round pond, and, oh yes, pink and white water lilies, their shimmering pads like clean hands open to sky, stems trailing into the barely visible muck, and tiny speckled fish burbling to the surface, then spiraling back down to the silt. Murky depths, the dirt that underlies us all.